I saw the empty frame before I felt the change in the room, before the conversation thinned, before the polite laughter turned into an instrument that cut air. The frame sat where the lake photograph had always hung, a dark oval of wood, the glass catching candlelight and offering nothing inside but wall and light. For 30 years that photograph had been proof, a small, ordinary ledger entry of a life I had lived with them. That evening it was gone, and the space where my face had been was a sharp absence, an accusation that hummed under the clink of forks. I said, quietly, "Did someone move the picture?" And my voice sounded small, like a coin dropped on a distant floor. My sister answered with a phrase that could have been kindness and also could have been a closing door. "We thought you'd want to change, Adam." My father looked at the tablecloth and touched his napkin, as if that could steady him. No one met my eyes. The air tightened. The hum of old jokes and carefully steered politics washed over me, as if the evening had always had a place for everything except me. That empty frame was not glass and wood. It was a verdict served quietly in a house that used to be gentle with my existence. I felt my throat go dry, and a small old panic, one I had not recalled in years, rose like a remembered tide. The humiliation did not arrive with a shout. It arrived with restraint, with the deliberate civility of people who had chosen silence over explanation. There are many kinds of insult. Some land like fists, others are surgical precise, made of omission. The photo at the lake, my arm around Mom, wind-burned, faces the kind of stupid, honest smile you only get when the sun is too bright, had been a present in my life for as long as I could remember. It had hung in the hallway that connected rooms full of histories, the kitchen where Mom left flour on the counter, the living room where Christmas lights drooped like tired promises, the small study where Dad kept his ledger and his quiet thoughts. That picture was a small proof that I had once been someone's center, that the story of my days had been told aloud beside the stories of theirs. I had driven home that afternoon to help set up for the Thanksgiving my mother had always insisted on. She had wanted one more family dinner, she had said, in the year before she became too thin to carry her own fork. We had come because the house felt like gravity, because memories pile up in rooms, and because the rituals of dishes and pie and small resentments are anchors when time loosens its knots. I arrived early, the winter light thin on the porch, my coat still smelling faintly of gasoline, and the damp parking lot. I walked the hallway without thinking. And then I did. The frame was empty, an exposed rectangle of pale wall, the screw holes like little dark teeth. For a few minutes I convinced myself someone had moved it to dust it. Someone would say it was misplaced. But later at the table, when I made a joke about it, the way my sister brushed it off felt rehearsed. "We're changing a few things around," she said, with a smile that did not reach her eyes. My father pretended to be absorbed in his gravy, as if there had been no theft at all. The humiliation was not merely that the picture was gone. It was the recalibration of memory, the way my presence could be treated as optional. It was as if someone had opened the family album, found my pages, and clipped them out with care. You live your life believing that there will be a ledger somewhere, some collection of moments that proves you existed here, that you were cared for, argued with, forgiven, annoyed, included. That evening the ledger had a blank line where my name should have been. I lay awake in the small guest room that night, listening to muffled television and the ticking of a clock that had always measured my mother's patience. I thought of parenthetical things, the faint glue detritus on the frame, back the way the photo had been used as a marker for other mundane things. Then thought gave way to a quieter, louder hurt, the idea that someone might be actively choosing to forget me. The first morning, after the world seemed slightly off-key, mail felt like evidence receipts, like affidavits. I made absurd practical observations I shared with no one: the particular scuff on the baseboard, by the old piano bench, the way the hallway smelled of lemon oil. It was childish, but those small sights were proof. Somewhere in the small ledger of things there were traces of me. What I did not say then, and would not say in full for weeks, was that the photograph's removal felt like the unmaking of small domestic proofs, the erasure of 100 tiny moments that had cumulatively said, "You are one of us." I tried the sensible route first. I asked my sister when she washed the casserole dish how she had liked the stuffing recipe small talk, then the question about the photograph. She laughed a little too loudly and said, "We thought you'd want a new look," as if the world was a catalogue and family design choices were neutral. My father, who had always been an island of gentle omissions, made a sound that could have been agreement or indifference. No one gave me a reason. There is a unique cruelty to being minimized by people who know the story of your life. When a partner or a stranger ignores you, the sting is sharp but manageable. When the people who could authenticate your entire past close ranks and choose silence, you begin to suspect that the ledger might have been only in your head. I started to question small things. Had I been overbearing to Dad? Had I been too pragmatic about Mom? Was my recollection of the hug at the lake a sentimental invention? The silence became an echo chamber. I would say a thing and the reply would be a softened, convenient reinterpretation. "We didn't think you'd mind," my sister told me once, as if my feelings were an accessory to be set aside. I began to measure conversations for tone, to inventory the ways they redirected me. Where once family had been a map, it became a maze of mirrors. I spoke, and the reflection came back slightly warped, as though memory itself had been edited, so I started collecting, not out of theatrical distrust, but as a small, steady way to anchor myself. I dug through old emails, found messages where I had confirmed flights home, invitations Mum had written, in the careful looping of her hand. I printed a few things and put them in a folder labeled with a humorless steadiness proof. It felt petty carrying proofs like talismans, but the proofs grounded me. When the conversation in the family chat skipped by and the word "thanks" was all I received for the albums I had scanned and posted, the folder was a private hearth in a night that had lost its stars. Distance crept in gradually, the way cold seeps along a windowsill. I began to attend fewer events because why present yourself to a room where your image could be politely removed? I told myself it was just a break, a vacation from the noise, but the truth was uglier. I felt small in a house I had helped fix, diminished by people who had been witnesses of my life. At work, distraction became my shadow. Meetings blurred. I found myself nodding through a conversation about budgets while my mind replayed the sound of my sister's voice dismissing me, the flat way she said, "We thought you'd want a new look. Friends noticed. You look tired," they'd say, and I'd offer a smile that looked more like an apology. I learned the choreography of not giving too much away. In those weeks, I began to equate family with surveillance, always present, never acknowledging. The group chat still pinged, still bubbled with weather jokes and quick updates about errands. But each time my name appeared, it was like punctuation, small, obligatory, detached. The ordinary scaffolding of life wobbled. I missed a deadline and told myself it was because I was unmoored. I turned down dinners because sitting with friends who actually saw me only underscored how invisible I had become in the house that built me. The emptiness of the frame followed me everywhere. I'd be in line for coffee and suddenly feel that same absence, the unacknowledged verdict, as though the barista might look past me too. It's strange how quickly one absence can seed 1,000 hallucinations. I began to reread old text threads, hunting for reassurance that I hadn't imagined being included, being wanted. Nights were the worst. Alone in my apartment, I would open the folder I'd started, proof. I'd hold those printed emails, Mom's looping handwriting on an old card, a photograph I'd snapped of Dad, fixing the gutter while I steadied the ladder. It was absurd, like a courtroom built in my living room. I wanted to believe I wasn't on trial, but the evidence was stacked on my coffee table. Each proof whispered that I had been here, I had done these things, I had mattered. When Christmas approached, I felt the old ache that used to be joy. The family traditions, lights, pie, Mum's voice, humming carols under her breath had all belonged to another lifetime. Now they felt like relics displayed in someone else's museum. I drove to their house anyway, like a moth to the last lamp on the street. The moment I walked in, the frame hit me again, still empty, still deliberate. My chest went tight. I asked again, almost timid, "Was there ever a plan to put something else there?" My sister's face hardened. "It's just decor, Adam. Don't overthink it." My father's silence was an accomplice. I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded and poured myself a drink. The ice clinked like mock applause. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the old study, surrounded by books Dad hadn't touched in years. I remembered Mum's last months, the argument that had split me from my sister like an axe to a tree. Mum was falling at night, wandering, forgetting names. I had said in blunt tones, "I regret now, she needs professional care. We can't keep her here like this." My sister had stared at me as if I'd sworn betrayal. "You want to send her away," she'd said. "You'd rather she die among strangers." I'd snapped back, "I want her safe, not broken on the floor." We hadn't resolved it. We just withdrew into silence, each of us hugging our righteousness. After Mum passed, that silence became cement. I had assumed time would soften it. Instead, the missing photograph told me it had calcified into resentment. I began to see the erasure as her quiet revenge, an unspoken verdict on my supposed betrayal. I tried confronting her once more. In the kitchen, away from Dad's ears, I asked, "Is this about Mum?" About what I said, her hands stilled on the dish towel. "Don't," she whispered, as if the word itself was fragile glass. Then louder, "You always make everything an argument. Sometimes it's just decor, Adam." And she walked away, leaving me standing there with the weight of everything unsaid. I left early the next morning, my suitcase heavy with more than clothes. On the drive home, snow thickened the roads, but the real blizzard was inside me. Every mile stretched the silence wider. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt like an exile carrying documents of a homeland no one else believed in. The months after were my downfall in slow motion. Work performance slipped. My boss asked if everything was all right, and I lied. Friends invited me out, and I made excuses until they stopped asking. Even my body mirrored the collapsed meals, skipped sleep, fractured a constant knot in my chest that no exercise could loosen. I had built my identity around being part of a family, and now that foundation was rubble. I began to believe the erasure. When you're told in silence that you don't belong, you start editing yourself too. I caught myself avoiding mirrors as though my own face might vanish like the photograph. The folder of proofs became both a lifeline and a curse. I flipped through it nightly, desperate for affirmation, but every page also reminded me of the void. I had proof of the past, but no bridge to the present. The future looked like a long corridor of being politely unremembered. The spring thaw didn't bring relief. It only revealed how bare everything had become. My apartment looked like a temporary shelter rather than a home. Piles of laundry waited like unanswered questions. I ate over the sink more often than at the table. Even my books, once my refuge, gathered dust, their spines slumping as if they'd given up on being opened. At work, patience for me thinned. I missed another deadline, a project that had once been routine. My boss pulled me aside and said carefully, "Adam, you're not yourself." The words stung because they were true. I was no longer myself, not the self anchored by family, by a mother's voice, by a photograph on the wall. I had become a ghost, haunting my own life. Friends texted, invited me out, but my replies were clipped. Busy. Next time. The truth was that laughter with them felt like betrayal of the ache inside me. Every time I tried to step into joy, that empty frame dragged me back. I became a collector of absences, counting the calls not made, the messages left unanswered, the silences that filled every room I used to belong in. I told myself stories to make sense of it. Maybe my sister had acted from pain, maybe the photograph had become unbearable for her after Mom died. But then I'd remember her flat denial. It's just decor, and my chest would tighten. If she had confessed even in anger, I might have understood. Instead, I was left with ambiguity sharpened into cruelty. The nights grew heavier. I would wake at 3 in the morning, heart racing, convinced I'd heard Mom's voice calling. But it was only the refrigerator hum, the settling of pipes. I'd sit at the kitchen table, staring at the proofs, my little courtroom. Sometimes I'd whisper to them as if the papers and photographs could testify. You were there. You know I loved her. You know I tried. The silence never answered back. One Sunday, I drove aimlessly, ending up near the cemetery. I didn't have flowers, only a coffee cup from the gas station. I sat by Mum's grave, tracing the letters of her name. They don't remember me, right? I said out loud, voice cracking. I tried to keep you safe, Mum. That's all I wanted. The wind carried no reply. Still speaking, it eased something in me, if only for an hour. I started skipping family events altogether. Easter passed with only a text in the group chat, Happy Easter. My sister responded with a sticker of a bunny, nothing more. The absence was now normalized, woven into the fabric of our interactions. Even Dad had adjusted his calls shorter, filled with weather reports instead of memories. I could feel my identity shrinking. Work titles, hobbies, routines, they all felt flimsy compared to the title I feared losing, son, brother, part of us. Without that, who was I? Just a man drifting in an apartment, eating over the sink, whispering to old papers. The lowest point came one night in June. I'd been drinking the proofs spread across the table like tarot cards. I stared at a photo of Mom laughing, her hand on my shoulder. The ache was unbearable, a physical weight pressing me into the chair. I thought briefly of how easy it would be to leave it all, to slip quietly out of this narrative that no longer had a place for me. The thought scared me sober. I pushed the photo away, trembling. Not like this, I whispered. Not like this. The next morning, with a headache and shaky hands, I realized I needed something, anything, that wasn't this spiral. I joined a grief support group, desperate enough to sit among strangers and admit what I couldn't say to my own blood. The first session was awkward. I listened more than I spoke, hearing stories of parents, spouses, siblings. One man described how his family pretended his brother had never existed, how they scrubbed his photos from albums. My chest clenched, so I wasn't alone. When it was my turn, I said, "They took down a photo of me with my mum. It feels like they took down me." My voice cracked. No one laughed. No one dismissed me. They nodded, eyes heavy with understanding. It wasn't a solution, but it was oxygen. For the first time in months, I felt seen. I began to attend weekly. Slowly, I shared more the argument with my sister, the silence of my father, the empty frame that haunted me. Each time I spoke, the group listened as though my words had weight. That act alone was healing. One evening after group, a man named Mark walked with me to the parking lot. He was older, steady in his movements. "You know," he said, "families can get grief wrong. They can weaponize it without even meaning to. Doesn't mean you're gone. You're still here." His words lingered. I wasn't gone. I was still here. It became a mantra I repeated when the loneliness pressed too close. I started making small changes, cooked an actual meal, walked in the park, Took my camera out for the first time in months. The photographs I captured weren't of family, but they were of life light. Through leaves, a child chasing pigeons, an old couple holding hands. Proofs of existence, even if not of belonging. Yet no matter how many new proofs I gathered, the wound at the center remained. My own family had erased me. And I still didn't know why. The summer sun came heavy, and with it came a message that cracked open the silence. My niece Lila, who was barely out of her teens but carried an honesty sharper than most adults, texted me out of nowhere. "Uncle Adam, did you notice anything weird at Mom and Dad's?" My stomach tightened. Weird wasn't a word she used lightly. I replied, "What do you mean?" She sent back a photo. It was the hallway, the one I knew by heart, the wood paneling, the dusty vent near the floor, the frame still hanging empty. She'd written under it, I asked Mom about the missing photo. She said she couldn't stand looking at it anymore, not after Grandma. My chest burned. Finally, a fragment of truth, though wrapped in cruelty. I asked, did she say why? We met 2 days later at a coffee shop that smelled like burnt beans and nostalgia. Lila leaned across the table, her voice low but steady. She said seeing that picture made her angry, Uncle Adam. Said it reminded her of how you wanted to put Grandma in a home. She said you didn't want her here, that you wanted convenience over care. Her words were knives, not because they were new, but because they confirmed what I had feared. The argument years ago in the kitchen had not died, it had festered. My blunt insistence on safety had been translated into betrayal, and my sister, unable to sit with that wound, had tried to erase me instead. I remembered that night vividly, Mom stumbling, catching herself on the counter. My heart pounding as I said, "She can't stay here like this. She needs help." My sister's face pale and rigid as she hissed, "You'd rather hand her to strangers," and my reply harsh with fear, "I'd rather her be alive." I thought time had softened it. Instead, it had calcified into a grudge strong enough to tear my photograph from the wall. I sat in that cafe staring at Lila's determined young face, and for the first time in months I felt the anger burn clean. So instead of talking to me, she erased me, I muttered. Lila's eyes softened. "She's hurting too. I don't think she realized what it would do to you." I wanted to argue, but the lump in my throat stopped me. Hurting people hurt people, that much I knew, but knowing it didn't make the frame less empty. That night I pulled out my folder of proofs again, but this time I saw them differently. They weren't just scraps defending my worth, they were reminders that I had been present, that I had fought for Mom in the only way I knew how. The evidence wasn't just for me anymore, it was for anyone who doubted the truth. Days later, Lila sent another message, this time to the family group chat. A photograph appeared, the lake picture scanned from an old box. Mum's arm around me, both of us laughing into the wind. Lila captioned it, simply, "Found this, thought we should all have a copy." My pulse raced as the chat lit up. Dad replied with a heart emoji, small but significant. My sister wrote only, "Thanks," but I felt the tremor. The silence had been punctured. The next family dinner, Lila sat beside me, her presence a quiet shield. Halfway through the meal, she asked across the table, as casually as if she were asking for salt. "Mom, why did you take down Uncle Adam's photo?" The words fell heavy into the room. Fawkes paused. My father looked between us, his lips parted but silent. My sister's cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth, closed it again. For a long moment the only sound was the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, she spoke, voice brittle. "Because I couldn't look at it. Every time I did, I remembered him wanting to send Mom away. I remembered feeling abandoned. I was angry, and I didn't want to see it." Her eyes flicked to me, then back to her plate. So I took it down. The honesty stung, but it was a wound exposed to air at last. I steadied my breath. I never wanted to abandon her. I said, my voice low but firm. I wanted her safe. I was terrified she'd fall and never get back up. I may have said it wrong, but it was out of love, not cruelty. Her shoulders slumped, a long sigh escaping. I know that now. Back then I couldn't hear it. All I heard was you trying to take her from me. And when she died, looking at that photo felt like a knife. Her voice cracked. I thought if I erased you from it, I could erase the hurt too. I stared at her, the woman who had shared my childhood, who had once defended me from bullies, who had braided Mom's hair in the hospital. She looked so small, drowning in her grief and her mistake. My anger softened, not vanished, but reshaped into something I could hold without burning. You hurt me, I said plainly. You made me feel like I didn't exist. Tears brimmed in her eyes. I'm sorry, Adam. I didn't know what else to do. The apology was not grand. It was not wrapped in bows or speeches. It was raw, clumsy, and real. And for the first time since the frame went empty, I believed reconciliation was possible. Rebuilding did not arrive like a sunrise. It came in fragments, in awkward gestures that felt too small to matter until they began to stack up into something solid. My sister and I did not hug that night. We didn't rush into forgiveness, but for the first time we had said the truth out loud. That was enough to plant a seed. The next weekend I drove over to Dad's to fix the porch light. The bulb had burned out weeks earlier, but he had been too stubborn to climb the ladder. In another time I might have left it, let him wrestle with his own pride. But now I carried the ladder from the garage, screwed in a new bulb, and lit the porch with a clean yellow glow. Dad stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching quietly. When I climbed down, he said, "Looks better?" It was just 2 words, but they landed heavier than most speeches. I began to visit more often, not with the frantic energy of someone desperate for validation, but with the slow rhythm of presence. I made coffee for Dad on Sunday mornings. Sometimes we sat in silence, sipping and watching the news. Other times he would tell me about the neighbor's new dog or the latest baseball scores. Nothing monumental, but each conversation was a brick in a wall being rebuilt. My sister was more cautious. At first, she hovered at the edges of the room, conversations, clipped eyes sliding away from mine. But she didn't leave the room anymore. That was progress. One evening, she asked if I could help her move boxes in the attic. It was a small request, but it felt like an invitation back into her space. We moved the boxes together, dust rising in the narrow beams of light. At one point, she found an old quilt Mom had made, frayed at the edges, but still carrying the faint scent of cedar. She unfolded it, her hands trembling. For a long moment, we both stood there silent. Then she handed me one corner, and together we folded it carefully as if honoring Mom's memory through the simple act of care. That night, she surprised me by asking, "Do you still have that photo, the one from the lake?" I nodded. "Yeah, I kept it." She hesitated, then said softly, "Maybe we should put it back up, not in the hallway, somewhere else." The suggestion was small, but it cracked something open in me. It wasn't just about the picture, it was about recognition, about restoring what had been stripped away. Outside the family, I began to rebuild myself too. I picked up my camera again, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. I started taking photos of ordinary things, the morning light spilling across my kitchen counter, a sparrow perched on the fence, a child chasing bubbles in the park. Each picture was proof of life, of beauty, of my place in the world. I even signed up for a photography class at the community center. It felt strange being the oldest student in the room, surrounded by teenagers and young adults. But the act of creating, of framing moments, gave me back a sense of agency. One of my photos, an old man's hands gripping a cane, was chosen for a small exhibit. Seeing it on the wall, my name printed underneath, filled me with a quiet pride I hadn't felt in years. When I showed the exhibit to Dad, he studied the photos carefully. He lingered on the one of the old man's hands, his brow furrowed. Finally, he said, "You've got Mom's eye for detail." It was the closest thing to a blessing he'd ever given, and it made my throat ache. My sister, too, began to thaw. She started sending me little messages, recipes. She thought I'd like updates about Lila, even a funny story about the neighbor's cat. They were mundane, but to me, they were miracles. Each text was a thread stitching me back into the fabric of family. The real turning point came one Saturday afternoon. My sister called and asked if I wanted to help cook dinner. When I arrived, she handed me a knife and a pile of onions. We worked side by side, chopping and stirring the kitchen, filling with the familiar smells of garlic and rosemary. At one point, she said quietly, "I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for taking down that photo, but I want to make things right." I looked at her, saw the grief still etched in her face, but also the sincerity. "We can't change what's past," I said, "but we can build something new." For the first time in years, she smiled at me without hesitation. It wasn't wide or perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. Healing didn't come with trumpets. It came in whispers, in small moments that felt fragile enough to break if I looked too closely. But over time, those whispers wove into something steadier, something almost like peace. The first real step came the evening my sister finally spoke without defenses. We were sitting on the porch, the repaired light casting a soft glow around us. She stared at her hands for a long time before saying I was wrong to take that photo down. "I thought I was protecting myself, but I hurt you instead." The words landed like rain on parched earth. I had imagined this moment for months, rehearsed sharp replies and long speeches. But when it came, all I could manage was a shaky, "Yeah, you did hurt me." She nodded, tears brimming. "I didn't want to face what you said back then. I couldn't stand the idea that you were right, that Mom needed more care than I could give. So I made you the villain in my head. It was easier than admitting I couldn't save her." Her honesty disarmed me. I felt the old anger rise, then soften. "I never wanted to be the villain," I said. "I just wanted her safe." I didn't say it kindly, but it came from love. She reached over, then hesitantly, and touched my arm. I know I see that now. That touchlight, as it was, felt heavier than years of silence. It was the first time since Mom's death that I believed we might find our way back. After that night, we started to rebuild traditions carefully. She invited me to Sunday dinners. At first, it was just the three of us, Dad, my sister and me, sitting at the table that had once felt hostile. The conversation was awkward, full of pauses and careful words, but the longer we sat, the more natural it became. Dad even told a joke one evening, his laugh rusty but genuine. One Sunday, my sister brought out a box of old photographs. She set it on the table without comment, but I understood the invitation. Together we sorted through the images, birthdays, graduations, vacations. Some photos made us laugh, others made us cry. When we reached the lake photo, my sister picked it up slowly, almost reverently. She looked at it for a long time before handing it to me. "Would you put this back up?" she asked. I swallowed hard, my throat thick. "Yeah, I'd like that." We didn't put it back in the hallway. Instead, we chose a new spot in the living room near the bookshelf where Mum used to keep her favorite novels. Hanging it there felt less like restoring the past and more like creating a new chapter. That act didn't erase the hurt, but it acknowledged it. And acknowledgement is the soil where forgiveness can grow. Outside of family, I found healing in my photography. I kept attending classes, kept capturing moments that reminded me life was still unfolding. One afternoon, I took a picture of a little girl holding her father's hand while crossing the street. The light caught their shadows perfectly stretching long across the pavement. Looking at that image later, I realized it mirrored what I craved, a steady hand guiding me forward. And slowly, I learned to offer that steady hand to myself. At group therapy, I began to speak with less shame. I shared about the photo being rehung, about my sister's apology. Mark, the man who had once told me, "You're still here," smiled wide. "See," he said, "families stumble. Sometimes they stomp on you, but they can learn too." His words echoed inside me. Maybe healing wasn't about erasing scars. Maybe it was about learning to live with them, to let them remind you of where you've been and how far you've come. Even Dad, who had been the quietest through it all, began to soften. One evening, as we watched a baseball game together, he said, without looking at me, "You know your mom was proud of how you spoke up for her. She told me once she felt safe knowing you were watching out." He cleared his throat, eyes still on the TV. "I should have told you that sooner." The tears that welled up in my eyes weren't from sadness. They were from the relief of finally being seen, finally being affirmed by the man whose approval I had chased my whole life. That night when I left, Dad stood at the door and said, "Drive safe, son." The word son hit me like a benediction. I carried it with me all the way home. Healing is rarely dramatic. It's the accumulation of moments like that, soft words, shared dinners, photographs rehung. It's the choice to keep showing up even when the past still aches. It's the decision to believe in tomorrow even when yesterday still whispers doubts. And little by little I began to believe. The first true reunion came not with a holiday, but with an ordinary Sunday dinner that somehow turned extraordinary. My sister had called earlier in the week, her voice lighter than I'd heard in years. "Come over Sunday," she said. "We'll make Mom's pot roast. Lila's helping." I arrived to the smell of rosemary and garlic drifting out the open kitchen window. For a moment, standing on the porch, I felt like a child again, returning from some long absence to the warmth of home. Dad opened the door before I could knock. "You're early," he said, but his eyes softened in a way that made me believe he was glad. Inside the table was already set the old quilt Mom had stitched folded neatly over one chair. My sister was at the stove, stirring with a concentration that reminded me of Mom's gentle focus. Lila darted around, setting plates, her laughter ringing clear. Dinner was simple, pot roast potatoes, green beans, but it carried the weight of ceremony. We sat together, and for once there was no empty frame looming over us. The photo of Mom and me at the lake now hung on the living room wall, where we could see it from the table. Its presence was no longer an accusation. It was a reminder we had survived and we were still here. Conversation flowed haltingly at first, then more freely. Lila told a story about a friend who'd tried to dye her hair pink and ended up with orange. My sister laughed so hard she had to put her fork down. Dad even chuckled, shaking his head. I found myself laughing too, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. At one point, my sister grew quiet. She set down her glass and looked at me. "Adam," she said, voice steady, "thank you for coming back. For not giving up on us." I held her gaze, saw the sincerity there. "I thought about giving up," I admitted. "But this is home. I couldn't stay away forever." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. This time, I didn't pull back. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Lila suggested we go through another box of photos she'd found in the attic. We sat on the floor, spreading the pictures out like cards. There was Dad in his army uniform, Mom holding us as toddlers, family picnics with ants on the tablecloth. Each photo sparked stories, some funny, some bittersweet. When we came to the lake photo again, Lila grinned. "This one's my favorite," she said. "You both look so happy." I stared at Mom's arm around me, at my own carefree smile. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the ache of loss. I felt gratitude for the moment itself, for the fact that it had survived, and for the chance to see it honored again. Later, as the night wound down, Dad cleared his throat. "Your mom would have liked this," he said quietly. All of us together laughing. She'd be proud. The room fell silent for a beat. Then my sister whispered, "I hope so." I looked at her, at Lila, at Dad. The grief was still there, but it no longer divided us. It sat with us softer now, part of the fabric instead of a tear in it. When I left that night, stepping onto the porch, under the warm glow of the repaired light, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Whole. Driving home, I realized healing wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't hurt. It was about choosing to stay, to try again, to rebuild even when the foundation had cracked. That empty frame had once been a wound, a symbol of erasure. Now it was a reminder of how far we'd come. We had taken something broken and made it into a new beginning, and for the first time since Mum's passing, I believed that the story of our family wasn't over. It was still being written, one dinner, one photo, one act of forgiveness at a time.